This is the story of Kohima, the improbable, savage, almost mythic little battle where a handful of British and Commonwealth soldiers held a ridge and, against overwhelming odds, blunted a Japanese invasion that had threatened to roll into India and change the course of the Burma Campaign. A story of mud and blood and desperate courage played out on a patch of ground no bigger than a small town square, yet of a scale and consequence that would echo across Southeast Asia. The battle began in early April 1944 when Japanese forces launched Operation Yugo, an audacious offensive aimed at invading British India. And it unfolded in 3 brutal stages from April to June 1944 around the tiny hill town of Kohima in the Naga Hills. A turning point in the campaign and, many historians argue, one of the most decisive Allied victories in the Southeast Asian theater. You can picture Kohima, a dusty little administrative town clinging to a ridgeline, a jumble of bungalows and gardens, and a single, almost trivial tennis court in the deputy commissioner's bungalow garden, that within days would become the epicenter of close-quarter fighting, so intimate and relentless that men fought inches from one another, sometimes with bayonets and sometimes with their teeth. The fighting around that tennis court turned it into a no-man's land, the court itself reduced to mud and shell-scarred earth, a tiny parcel of land that would live on in military memory as the Battle of the Tennis Court. The defenders were an eclectic, understrength mix: British soldiers, Indian infantry, Assam rifles, and other Commonwealth units thrown together and ordered to hold the ridge at all costs. They were not a polished battle group with ample reinforcements. They were a patchwork of units, many understrength and badly supplied, but they had one thing the Japanese did not expect: stubbornness, an almost ferocious determination to not give an inch of their position, and the logistical lifeline of air resupply that, though tenuous and dangerous, kept them supplied with the bare essentials they needed to survive the siege. Now let's slow it down and meet the moment as if you were there. The Japanese 15th Army, confident from months of victories across Burma, and driven by a belief that a bold push into India would spark rebellion and sever Allied supply lines, pushed up into the Naga Hills with a plan to cut off the important railhead at Dimapur and then advance westward. They thought speed and ferocity would win the day, and for a while they did, encircling Kohima and isolating it from ground reinforcements. The defenders found themselves holding a short ridgeline that dominated the approaches, but holding it was like standing in a sieve under a rain of artillery and mortar, with Japanese troops slashing through the jungle and digging in close to the British positions, so that the fields between trenches became murderously contested ground. Imagine the men in that first week, exhausted, hungry, listening to the sound of distant guns that kept creeping closer, ration tins opened and cold, their world reduced to a few yards of trench, the tennis court, the bungalow, the deputy commissioner's garden. And yet they held, sometimes because of orders, sometimes because of sheer pride, often because there was simply nowhere else to go. And then there was the human oddity of modern war: aircraft overhead, parachutes drifting down with parcels of food, ammunition, sometimes even medical supplies, a lifeline from the sky that turned out to be the difference between mere survival and outright collapse. If you ask how a small, improvised force could stop a professional Japanese division, the answers are many and mixed. Terrain favored the defenders in the sense that the approaches were narrow and choked with jungle, making massed Japanese attacks costly. The defenders dug in and used improvised fortifications to create interlocking fields of fire. And, crucially, reinforcements were on their way. The 14th Army under General Slim had moved to throw the weight of its resources into the theater and to relieve Kohima and nearby Imphal. But none of these strategic explanations capture the human texture of what happened on the ridge. Isolated companies would find themselves surrounded, cut off, and forced into hand-to-hand fighting. Yet small groups would counterattack at night, reclaiming hedgerows and ruined bungalows piece by piece. It was a grinding, personal fight, in which discipline and small unit leadership mattered more than grand maneuvers. One of the defining images that would stick in the history books and in the minds of veterans, is the tennis court itself. Trenches and shell holes perimetered the court. The grass churned into mud, and at times the two sides were so close that men could hear each other breathing and communicate with gestures across the ditch. Snipers, grenades, and bayonet charges turned the DC's garden into a tableau of ebbing and surging control, as the British and Indian units slowly, viciously, pushed the Japanese back from house to house. The fighting was often grotesquely intimate, with daylight assaults swallowed by the jungle, and at night the defenders crawling out to reclaim their lost positions, under the risk of machine gun fire and close assaults. In telling this story, you need not romanticize the participants. They were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, but you also cannot ignore the extraordinary leadership on display, especially at small unit level. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers who organized counterattacks, improvised defenses, and held their men together with a mix of calm, grit, and sometimes brutal directness. Names from the regiments that fought crop up in dispatches and medals. Officers decorated for conspicuous gallantry, sergeants who held positions against repeated assaults, and those acts of courage added up to a defense that bled the Japanese offensive dry. If you read the official reports, the defenders of Kohima, a mosaic that included the 161st Indian Brigade, the Royal West Kent Regiment, Assam Rifles, and other units, endured some of the most intense attritional fighting of the whole Burma Campaign, holding the ridge for days while under siege until relief columns could punch through and link up. The Japanese, for their part, fought with an intensity born of both professional training and a rigid doctrine of offense. Their assaults were often conducted with the intention of closing with the enemy and engaging in bayonet charges or close quarters to negate artillery and air power advantages. But such attacks, when launched against prepared positions in constricted terrain that allowed the defenders to fire into choked approaches, tended to produce crushing casualties. The record shows that Operation Yugo, which included the twin thrusts at Imphal and Kohima, ultimately foundered because Japanese logistics could not sustain their forward troops. Supply lines were overextended, and their casualties mounted beyond replacement. The net result was catastrophic for the Japanese 15th Army, forced into retreat and suffering losses that undermined Japan's capacity to wage an offensive in the theater. But numbers tell a blunt story, and the human cost was awful. Civil and military records compiled after the campaign show that Japanese casualties in the Imphal-Kohima operation ran into the tens of thousands, far higher than Allied losses, and by the summer of 1944, the Japanese were being forced back across the Chindwin River as their offensive collapsed, an outcome that helped set the stage for the Allied reconquest of Burma in the following years. If you want to understand the rhythm of the battle, think in cycles. A day of bombardment, an assault in the morning, firefights and bayonet charges through the afternoon, a temporary lull, and then at night the defenders would scavenge and mend, hoping that the planes would come with more tins of bully beef and leftover ammunition. Sometimes the fighting stalled for a day or two, giving an eerie quiet, but then, like a sickness that returned, the Japanese would surge again, attempting to sneak forward in the jungle to outflank a parapet, or to lob a mortar into a trench, and throw men into confusion. And just when morale sagged under the strain, a small act, a message from HQ promising reinforcements, a wounded comrade evacuated by stretcher, a particularly well-timed artillery barrage on an enemy sap, would stiffen the resolve and make another stand possible. It was war reduced to inches and breaths. The scale of the battle, even though fought on a narrow ridge, was more about endurance than grandeur. Another element that shaped the battle's outcome was logistics and air superiority. The Allies, finally, could bring aircraft to bear in ways the Japanese could not match in that theater. Air resupply kept defenders alive, and Allied air attacks harried Japanese supply columns and assembly areas. By denying the Japanese the ability to concentrate and resupply at will, air power fractured the offensive's momentum. Still, none of this explains why a handful of men, sometimes reduced to mere dozens in isolated pockets, could refuse to yield in the face of a determined division. That answer lies in a mix of training, leadership, cohesion, and sheer stubbornness. Many of the British and Indian troops had fought earlier in the retreat through Burma and arrived at Kohima with a hard-won sense of discipline and experience in jungle warfare. They had also learned to fight as small, flexible units in difficult terrain, which meant that when Japanese columns attacked, defending platoons could respond in ways that disrupted the attacker's rhythm and inflicted disproportionate casualties. Leadership mattered too. Junior officers who understood the local ground and who could improvise under fire made tactical choices that blunted Japanese assaults, choosing where to leave interlocking fields of fire, when to counterattack, and when to risk a bayonet rush to recapture a trench. Perhaps most of all, the defenders understood the moral power of not ceding ground. Once the idea took hold that the ridge must be held, men dug deep into a kind of grim collective will that turned ordinary courage into sustained resistance. After weeks of grinding action, the relief finally arrived. British and Indian reinforcements pushed through, the siege was lifted, and the Japanese, already overstretched and suffering heavy losses, found themselves forced onto the defensive. The failure of Operation Yugo marked a strategic turning point, as the Japanese 15th Army's losses and loss of momentum meant that the initiative in Burma passed to the Allies, who could now plan and mount counteroffensives with renewed confidence. The books and museums that recall Kohima do not shy from this. Kohima, alongside Imphal, represented a moment when the Japanese gamble to invade India failed spectacularly, and the Allied position in Southeast Asia began to solidify toward eventual victory. What about the individual stories that give the battle its human face? They are countless and often harrowing. Medics who crawled into open ground to retrieve wounded men under fire. Signalers who kept patchy communications running while shellfire severed wires. Platoons that ran out of ammunition and fought with captured enemy rifles. Soldiers who, when their positions were overrun, fought silently in the dark to kill or wound their adversary and deny them the use of the ground. In the aftermath, war correspondents and historians gathered these fragments into testimony and dispatches that painted a picture of hardship and bravery, the kind of episodes that would later earn gallantry awards and medals. Even the Kohima War Cemetery, with its cross of sacrifice and neat rows of graves overlooking the town today, feels like an attempt to impose order and remembrance on a chaotic and brutal past. The cemetery and memorials stand as a sober counterpoint to the mythologizing impulse, reminding visitors of the real human lives spent on those hills. There is a particular phrase that stuck in British public memory after the battle, that Kohima was a sort of British Thermopylae, invoking the ancient stand of Spartan warriors at Thermopylae as an analogy for a tiny force holding a strategic pass against a numerically superior enemy. The comparison is rhetorically powerful and helped frame the narrative in post-war memory, though military historians caution that such analogies can oversimplify. Kohima was not simply a heroic last stand, but part of a larger operational picture that included supply, reinforcements, and larger strategic failures on the Japanese side that contributed to their defeat. Still, the idea of a small group holding a pass resonates, and the images of soldiers clinging to the tennis court and bungalows on the ridge do evoke that primal drama. Telling the story of Kohima also forces you to think about civilians, the Nagas and local people whose lives were shattered by the fighting. Villagers were displaced, homes destroyed, and the local landscape changed forever. Many of the local people aided the British with guides, intelligence, and sometimes food, but they also bore the heavy costs of occupation and combat in their homeland, a reminder that battles are not fought in vacuums, but on land that belongs to people with their own lives and histories. The moral burden of war lives on in those communities, as much as it does on the soldiers' graves. And what of the Japanese perspective? Their commanders believed in the offensive, in bold drives to break the enemy. But Imperial Japan's strategic calculus in 1944 was under strain. Logistics in the jungle were punishing, and the longer supply lines and attritional nature of the conflict exhausted their forces. The culture of offensive spirit, while admirable in some ways, could not overcome the practical realities of moving fuel, ammunition, and food through mountain trails and jungle tracks under Allied interdiction. The losses at Imphal and Kohima were therefore not just tactical defeats, but strategic blows that diminished Japan's operational freedom in the theater for months, if not years. There is a final, sobering bookend to all this. The post-war remembrance, the medals, the memoirs, the historians' debates. Was Kohima Britain's greatest battle? Some argue yes, on the grounds that it represented a pivotal turning point and involved fierce, costly fighting that secured the eastern flank of India. Others nudge back, suggesting that the twin battles of Imphal and Kohima must be considered together, that the larger operational context matters, and that the traditional Eurocentric narratives of decisive British victories should be balanced with recognition of the enormous contributions and sacrifices of Indian soldiers and local populations, whose names often don't feature as prominently in English-language accounts. The truth is messy. Kohima matters because of what happened on that ridge, and because of what it enabled strategically, and because the stories of courage and suffering that emerged there are worth remembering and retelling honestly. If you're making a film or a documentary about Kohima, you'd structure it like this. Begin with the quiet town before the storm. Show the Japanese plans and the grand strategic gamble. Then zoom in on the ridge where ordinary men become extraordinary out of necessity. Use first-hand accounts for texture, the medic's voice, the lieutenant's terse radio log, the whispered prayers in the trench, and intersperse with aerial shots of the jungle and the ridgeline to show the crushing scale of the terrain. You'd punctuate the narrative with the almost grotesque intimacy of the tennis court fighting, and later, toward the end, bring in the relief column breaking through, the stooped soldiers limping back to field kitchens, the dead being collected, and the quiet of the cemetery, where the cross of sacrifice stands against a far-off skyline. You'd want music that begins sparse and builds to something harrowing, and then quiets into elegy. You would want the narration to be spare and precise, not grandiose, so that the real human facts, hunger, mud, fear, courage, carry the weight. And you would, if you were honest, end on a reflective note. Kohima is both a tactical lesson and a human parable about how small acts of collective resolve can change larger currents, and about how war takes from communities and men alike. For sourcing, the official British accounts and the Kohima Museum archives lay out the operational chronology and the particulars of unit dispositions, and show how a mix of stubborn defense, air supply, and timely relief produced an Allied victory. Academic accounts and histories of the Imphal-Kohima campaign give the wider context and the strategic fallout that followed the Japanese retreat, while veterans' memoirs and regimental histories provide the raw, personal textures of day-to-day survival on the ridge. Finally, because every retelling must wrestle with meaning, Kohima teaches that terrain and logistics matter as much as troop numbers, that small unit leadership can be decisive, and that the human will to hold a place, for family, country, or simply for the man next to you in a trench, is a potent force. It is also a warning about the cost of hubris in war, for the Japanese plan was bold but unsustainable, and when strategy ignores supply and climate, it courts disaster. Today the tennis court is gone, the bungalows are rubble under grass, and the cemetery registers the names of the dead. But the memory of those days in April through June 1944 remains as a stark, instructive, and sorrowful chapter in the larger story of World War II in Asia. A tiny patch of ground where courage and grit turned back an offensive and changed a campaign. If you want more on this, I've pulled from the official Battle of Kohima summaries and the wartime files, from regimental accounts and the Kohima Museum's detailed chronologies, and I'll link some of that reading in the description. There are great photo archives and a moving collection of veteran interviews that bring the dirt and the fear and the bravery into sharper focus. And if you liked this deep dive, hit subscribe for more long-form history episodes where we take one place, one day, and tell the story of how the world tilted a little because of what happened there.